My father didn't die quietly. He died in a hospital bed that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, with a rerun of Wheel of Fortune playing on mute above his head, and my older brother holding his hand like he was already thinking about the will. I was 3 hours away when the call came. I'd been in the middle of a deposition. I'm a paralegal, not an attorney, but I've spent enough years in law offices to know when something doesn't add up. I know what a forged signature looks like. I know what pressure looks like dressed up as paperwork. I didn't know yet that I'd need both of those skills before the month was over. The funeral was on a Tuesday. It rained the way it only rains in Georgia in October. Thick, warm, too heavy for an umbrella to do much good. My mother stood at the graveside in a black coat I'd never seen before, her hands folded in front of her face completely still. She didn't cry. She'd been married to my father for 41 years, and she didn't cry at his funeral. I didn't think much of it then. Some people go quiet when grief gets too big. My brother, I'll just call him my brother because his name isn't worth the breath, stood next to her in a charcoal suit, one hand on her shoulder, nodding at every person who came to offer condolences, like he was already the head of something. His girlfriend of 7 years, Tamsin, stood just behind him, wearing dark sunglasses even though it was overcast, not grieving sunglasses. The kind you wear when you don't want people to read your face. I'd never trusted Tamsin. I want to be honest about that up front, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story about me being right. It's a story about my father being failed, and the difference matters. After the burial, I was walking to my car when a woman I didn't recognize fell into step beside me. Mid-50s, sensible flats, the kind of practical face that belongs to someone who has spent decades solving other people's problems. She didn't make eye contact right away. "You're his daughter," she said. Not a question. "I am." She glanced once at the cluster of people near the tent where my brother was shaking hands with someone from our father's old bowling league. Then she looked at me directly. "I need you to come by the office tomorrow. Don't tell your brother. Don't mention it to anyone in your family." She pressed a card into my hand. "I mean that sincerely." I looked down at the card. Loretta Finch, estate attorney, an address on Peachtree Industrial. "My father's estate attorney," I said. "Yes." "He never mentioned you to me." "He wouldn't have," she said carefully. "He was protecting something. I think you'll understand once you see it." She walked away before I could ask her anything else, moving quickly through the crowd like she'd had practice disappearing from rooms. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could bring myself to start the engine. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Through the windshield, I watched my brother help my mother toward a waiting car, his hand on her elbow steering her. The way he moved reminded me of something I couldn't name yet, something familiar and wrong at the same time. I drove home in silence. I didn't sleep. I lay in the bed in my childhood room. I'd been staying at my parents' house to help manage things, and stared at a water stain on the ceiling that had been there since I was 12. My father had always meant to fix it. He'd meant to fix a lot of things. He'd been sick for 2 years. Not dramatically sick, not the kind of sick that announced itself. Type 2 diabetes, some kidney issues, fatigue that kept getting worse. Nothing that should have killed him at 67. His doctor had been adjusting medications for months. His energy had dropped so sharply in his last 6 months that he'd stopped driving, stopped going to his Wednesday poker game, stopped doing most of the things that made him himself. I hadn't been around enough to see the full shape of it. I'd come home on weekends when I could, called 3 or 4 times a week. But I lived 3 hours away and I had a job and I kept telling myself he was stable. The doctors had it handled. My brother lived 20 minutes from my parents. He'd been the one there. I hadn't questioned that until now. The next morning, I told my mother I had an errand to run. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, still in that closed-off stillness she'd had at the graveside. My brother's car wasn't in the driveway. I left before he could show up. Loretta Finch's office was on the second floor of a low brick building that also housed a tax preparer and a physical therapist. A waiting room had ficus plants and magazines from 2 years ago, Her assistant brought me water I didn't ask for and showed me into a corner office that smelled like cedar and old books. Loretta was already sitting behind her desk when I came in. She stood to shake my hand, then gestured to the chair across from her and got straight to the point. I appreciated that. Your father first came to see me 14 months ago, she said, without your brother's knowledge. I set my water glass down. He was concerned about changes he'd noticed in his accounts. Small amounts going out, 50 here, 100 there, but consistent. He said he'd started to feel like he wasn't fully in control of his own finances. What do you mean, not in control? He said your brother had offered to help manage his bills after he got too tired to keep up with them himself. Your father appreciated it at first, but then he noticed that the amounts being paid didn't always match what he remembered. And when he asked questions, he said the answers were always just slightly off. Not wrong enough to prove, just wrong enough to worry him. I didn't say anything. I was listening the way I listened in depositions with everything. He also told me that his medication schedule had changed, that your brother had started picking up his prescriptions, organizing his pill case each week, and that he'd started feeling worse around the same time. The room went very still. He suspected his brother, I said. He didn't use that word. He said he was probably just being a paranoid old man. She folded her hands on the desk, but he wanted to document everything. He gave me copies of his bank statements going back 18 months with discrepancies circled. He wrote a 3-page letter describing the pattern he'd noticed in his health, and he changed his will. Changed it how? She opened a file folder. Originally, your father's estate was split equally between you and your brother. Property, savings, a small investment account. About $400,000 total, not counting the house. She looked up. 14 months ago, he changed the primary beneficiary to you, solely. The air in the room felt different after she said it. He told me he wasn't certain of anything, she said. He said he might be wrong, but he wanted someone outside the family to hold the documentation, someone your brother couldn't get to. She slid the folder across the desk. He said if anything happened to him, I should contact you, not the police, you. I put my hand on the folder and didn't open it. Why not the police? He was afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of what it would do to your mother. And, she paused, choosing carefully, he was afraid of what your brother might do if he found out he was being watched. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with my father, 3 weeks before he died. I'd called on a Sunday evening, and he'd sounded tired but lucid. He'd asked me about work, about whether I was eating properly, about a book I mentioned wanting to read. He hadn't said anything was wrong. I'd had no idea he was building a case in the dark. Can I take this? I asked, touching the folder. It's yours, she said. He made sure of that. I drove back to my parents' house with the folder on the passenger seat and the windows down, needing air that didn't have grief in it. My phone buzzed before I turned onto the highway. My brother. Hey, where'd you go this morning? Mom said you had an errand. Everything okay? I put the phone face down. Everything was not okay. Everything was the opposite of okay. But I needed to think before I moved, and I needed to move carefully, because I was about to look through documents that might confirm that my brother, the person who had been our father's closest caretaker for the last 2 years, had been systematically stealing from a sick old man and possibly making him sicker. That thought sat in my chest like something I couldn't swallow. Back at the house, I waited until my mother took her afternoon rest before I went to my father's study and spread everything out across his desk. He'd always kept it meticulously organized, colored sticky flags on folders, dates written in his neat blocky handwriting. There was something unbearable about sitting in his chair and going through paper he'd put there for me to find. The bank records came first. Loretta had arranged them chronologically. The discrepancies were small enough that they might have passed unnoticed. An ATM withdrawal for $200 here, a transfer to an account labeled home maintenance there. But the home maintenance account wasn't one my father had ever set up. And the ATM withdrawals, 12 of them over the past 16 months, had all been made at the same branch, One located a mile from my brother's apartment. My father didn't have a car in the last year. He couldn't have made those withdrawals. I moved to the letter my father had written. It was typed, which told me he'd done it carefully, deliberately, 4 pages. He described the pattern starting in the spring 2 years ago, when my brother had volunteered to take over bill management. He described the way his energy had declined, more than his doctors seemed to account for. He described a day when he'd felt strong enough to go through his own pill case and realized that 2 of the supplements my brother brought weekly were in unmarked containers he didn't recognize. He'd thrown them out. He'd felt better for about a week. Then my brother had brought new ones. My father had written, "I don't know if I'm right. I hope I'm wrong. But if something happens to me before I can figure it out, I want someone to look at this with clear eyes. Your sister has that. She always has." I put the letter down and pressed my hands flat on the desk. The house was quiet. My mother's door was closed down the hall. Outside, a lawn mower hummed somewhere in the neighborhood, completely indifferent. I picked up my phone and called my father's primary care doctor's office. I'd been listed as a secondary contact on his medical file for years. One of those things my parents had done when he first started getting sick, just in case. The receptionist put me through to a nurse who confirmed what I already feared. 2 of the supplements in my father's official chart didn't match what had been found in his system during his last hospitalization. His potassium levels had been chronically low. His kidney function had deteriorated faster than his diagnosis explained. "Did anyone investigate that?" I asked. A pause. The attending noted it as possible medication interaction. It wasn't flagged for follow-up. "Is there a way to request a full toxicology review of his records?" Another pause, longer this time. "That would typically require an official inquiry." "I understand," I said. "Thank you." I hung up and sat very still. My brother's name kept running through my mind in a loop that felt wrong no matter how many times it cycled. I'd known him my whole life. I'd split a bedroom with him until I was 11. He'd driven me to my first day of high school because my parents both had to work. He'd given a toast at my college graduation that made our mother cry. And he had spent the last 2 years systematically stealing from our sick father and possibly— I still didn't want to finish that sentence. He'd had motive. He'd had debt. I knew that. I just hadn't wanted to think about it. He'd borrowed money twice from our parents over the past 5 years. He worked in sales, commissions that swung wildly, and Tamsin didn't work steadily. They'd been living on the edge of something I wasn't supposed to notice. Proximity. He'd been there constantly. He had keys. He managed medications and meals and appointments. He knew every routine. Time. 2 years, long enough to cover tracks, long enough to normalize everything as just helping. My phone buzzed again. "My brother, I'm coming by for dinner." "Thought I'd pick up groceries. Any requests?" I read it 3 times. He was about to walk into this house, into this kitchen, and present himself as someone who cared. I typed back, "No thanks, I've got it covered." 15 minutes later, "I'll just come by anyway. Mom needs the company." That was the moment I stopped feeling paralyzed. Something shifted. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. The kind that comes when you finally accept that a situation is as bad as you suspected, and you have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. I took photos of every document in the folder, emailed them to myself from 3 different accounts, wrote the name of Loretta Finch's firm on a notepad, and tucked it inside a book on the shelf. A copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that had been in this house since before I was born. Then I called the county sheriff's office. Not because I was certain, because my father hadn't been either, and it hadn't protected him. The detective who called me back worked financial crimes and was named after no one important except himself. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything, which I did methodically. The bank records, the letter, the medication discrepancy, the toxicology gap. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The estate attorney still has the originals?" he asked. "Yes." "And you're listed as next of kin for medical records?" "For secondary access, yes." "All right," he said. "Don't confront your brother. Don't give any indication that you've seen these documents. Can you do that?" I've been managing discovery and litigation cases for 9 years, I said. I can do that. Good. A brief pause. I'm going to reach out to the estate attorney and to the medical examiner's office. Your father's case is recent enough that a formal review is possible. Another pause. In the meantime, I need you to be careful. People who've been doing something like this for a long time get nervous when they think things are about to unravel. He doesn't know anything is unraveling, I said. Not yet, he said. My brother arrived at 6 with 2 bags of groceries and a bottle of red wine. Tamsin was with him, already talking as she came through the door about how she picked the wine at this great little shop near their place. I watched them settle into my parents' kitchen with the ease of people who felt completely at home, and it occurred to me that this was partly the point. They'd made themselves indispensable enough that their presence here was unremarkable, expected, almost required. My mother came downstairs looking slightly more like herself. She smiled at my brother when he hugged her. I watched him over her shoulder and kept my face completely neutral. Dinner was pasta from a jar of sauce and garlic bread that came out slightly burnt because nobody was really paying attention to the oven. My brother talked through most of it. About work, about a trip he and Tamsin were supposedly planning, about a neighbour of his who'd gotten into some kind of dispute over a fence. He was performing normalcy at a level that probably would have convinced me a week ago. I want to talk about the estate process, he said, as Tamsin was clearing plates. Get things moving before Mum has to think about it too much. My mother looked up. So soon? It's better to do it while things are organised, he said. I was looking into it, and there are a few accounts we'd want to consolidate. Simplify everything. He looked at me then, neutral, pleasant, waiting. What accounts? I asked. Just the investment stuff. The things Dad had set up years ago that aren't really optimized anymore. Consolidate, simplify, optimize, words that meant something if you knew what you were looking for. I'd want to loop in an attorney before we do anything like that, I said. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Barely perceptible. I'd seen that shift in deposition witnesses when they realized the question they'd just been asked wasn't actually simple. We already have one, he said. Dad's estate attorney. Which one? I asked. A half-second pause. I've been handling that. I'll get you the details. Tamsin came back to the table and sat down, and my brother changed the subject to something about the neighbour's fence again, and I let it go. I wasn't there to confront him. I was there to watch him feel confident, which was far more useful. After they left, I helped my mother wash the dishes. She was quiet, the same way she'd been quiet all day. I was almost done rinsing when she said, without looking up from the sink, "Your brother changed something last year. I could feel it, but your father said I was imagining things." I turned off the water. "What did you feel?" I asked carefully. That he wanted something. She handed me a wet glass. That the helping wasn't really about helping. She didn't say anything else. She went upstairs to bed, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time, holding a dish towel, thinking about how much my father had tried to protect her from knowing. The next 3 weeks moved slowly and then very fast. The detective's office requested a formal review of my father's medical records. The medical examiner found a pattern consistent with chronic low-grade exposure to a diuretic compound, something that would accelerate kidney decline in someone with my father's existing conditions. Not dramatic, not obvious. The kind of thing that would look, over time, like a natural progression of illness. The supplements my father had thrown out were gone, but my brother hadn't known about the ones my father had quietly set aside. One container, still sealed, found in the back of the top shelf in the study closet during the detective's authorized search of the house. My father had written the date and his brother's initials on the bottom in black marker, the way you'd log evidence you weren't sure you'd ever need to present. The financial records told the rest of it. My brother had been drawing from 3 accounts over 22 months, not huge amounts individually, but cumulative. $43,000 hidden across cash withdrawals, transfers labelled as utility payments, and one transfer to a joint account he'd opened with Tamsin that my father hadn't known about. My father had known something. He hadn't known enough. He'd been too sick, too tired, too unwilling to believe that someone he'd raised could do this. He'd done the only thing within his reach. He'd found a lawyer, left a paper trail, and trusted that I would follow it. My brother was arrested on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before what would have been my parents' 42nd anniversary. Tamsin was arrested 40 minutes later at their apartment, trying to delete files from a laptop she didn't know had already been imaged by a forensic subcontractor the previous day. I wasn't there for either arrest. I found out by phone. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store and stared at the dashboard for a while, not feeling triumphant, not crying, just understanding very completely that what I'd spent the last 3 weeks doing had cost something that wouldn't be reimbursable. The version of my family where my brother was only flawed, only struggling, only in over his head, that version was finished. My mother took it the way she'd taken the grief, quietly and all at once. She sat at the kitchen table when I told her, her hands around a mug of tea again, and she listened to everything. When I finished, she said, "I want to see whatever your father wrote." I gave her the letter. She read it twice, slowly. Then she folded it and held it in both hands for a long moment. "He was always trying not to worry me," she said. "I know." "He should have worried me," she said. "I would have wanted to know." The trial was 4 months later. My brother's attorney tried 3 different angles: that the financial discrepancies were mismanagement, not theft, that the supplement was purchased legally for personal use, that my father's health had declined naturally. Each argument dissolved under the weight of what my father had quietly assembled: bank records, dated notes, a carefully labeled container on a shelf. A 4-page letter that a jury heard read aloud in full. When they got to that section, "Your sister has clear eyes. She always has." I looked at my hands in my lap. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon. My brother was convicted on 2 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and 1 count of elder abuse. Tamsin was convicted as a co-conspirator on the financial charges. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. He looked at me when the jury foreman finished reading, not with the raw resentment I'd braced for, more with something exhausted and small, the expression of someone who had run a very long con and understood, finally, that it was done. I didn't look away. I didn't need to. My mother and I drove home together. She asked if I wanted to stop for coffee, and I said yes. And we sat in a diner booth for an hour and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it: a show she'd been watching, a recipe she wanted to try, a trip she thought maybe she'd like to take someday, somewhere with mountains. She seemed lighter than she'd been in months, maybe years. My father hadn't been able to protect himself. He'd been too sick, too trusting, too generous with a son who had stopped deserving it. But he'd done the one thing he could. He'd left a trail for someone who wouldn't flinch from following it. I went back to work the following Monday. I sat down on my desk, opened a new file, and started reading. That's what you do with clear eyes. You keep going. What I keep coming back to is the pill case. My father, sitting alone in his study, opening it and noticing something was off. Not calling anyone, not accusing anyone, just quietly setting aside what didn't seem right, writing down the date and waiting to understand more before he spoke. That image stays with me more than the verdict, more than the handcuffs, more than anything that happened in that courtroom. My father was not a perfect man. He was stubborn. He held grudges longer than necessary. He once refused to speak to a neighbor for 2 years over a property line dispute that turned out to be 3 inches. But he had a moral core that I never once questioned. He knew right from wrong at a level that was almost cellular, and when he realized someone he loved was betraying him, he didn't explode. He didn't confront. He documented. He protected my mother. He found a lawyer he could trust, and he left a trail for me because he believed I would follow it all the way to the end. That kind of integrity doesn't get enough credit. We talk about character like it's something you display in the good moments, when it's easy, when everyone is watching. My father showed his character in private, when he was sick and scared, and the person wronging him was someone he'd raised. He chose honesty over peace. He chose truth over the comfort of not knowing. That cost him something. I'm sure of it. I think about what it took for me to walk into Loretta's office that morning. I'd spent years training myself to read documents, to spot inconsistencies, to stay steady when the facts pointed somewhere uncomfortable. None of that prepared me for the moment I understood what my father's letter actually meant. The knowledge that your own brother could do something like this. It doesn't land cleanly. It lands in pieces over days. And each piece requires you to think your way through it rather than feel your way through it, because feeling your way through it leads to paralysis. What got me through was the work, staying focused on what was provable, what was documentable, what could be handed to someone with authority to act on it. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I understood that my feelings weren't the point. My father's truth was the point, and getting to it required me to keep my head clear when everything in me wanted to fall apart. There's something I want to say to anyone watching this who has ever had to do something hard inside their own family. It is not weak to hold yourself together. It is not cold to think clearly when the people around you are unraveling. The ability to stay steady under that kind of pressure, to keep going when you're grieving, when you're angry, when the person who wronged you is standing across a dinner table smiling at your mother. That steadiness is not something to apologize for. It's what allows justice to happen at all. My father knew that about me. He said so in 4 pages he typed at his desk when he was too sick to drive and too afraid to speak out loud. He trusted my discipline. He trusted my clarity. He trusted that I would not flinch. I didn't, and he was right. The trail he left was only useful because someone was willing to follow it without looking away. That's the part nobody talks about in stories like this, not the dramatic arrest, not the courtroom, not the verdict. The part that matters is the quiet, exhausting, unglamorous work of deciding that the truth deserves someone who won't quit on it. My father made that decision from his study alone when he was running out of time. I made it in a parking lot, in a diner, at a detective's desk, in a courtroom. We both kept going. That's what we owed each other. That's what we owed him.